Margaret Holt pressed the barrel of her dead husband's revolver against the banker's chest before the man could step down from his horse. Her hands didn't shake. They'd stopped shaking 6 weeks ago, right around the time she'd found the mortgage papers Robert had hidden beneath the kitchen floorboards. Signed, sealed, and never once mentioned to her in 4 years of marriage. "Ride onto this land again before Friday," she said quietly, "and I'll give you a reason to remember my name." That was when boots hit her porch steps, heavy, unhurried, and a voice she didn't know said, "Ma'am, I came about the deed." If you want to know what happened next, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time, because this is the kind of story that will stay with you long after it's over. The banker's name was Harlan Voss, and he had the particular kind of stillness that men develop when they've spent years watching other people lose things. He didn't reach for the gun at his hip. He didn't back his horse away. He just looked down at Margaret Holt with those flat, patient eyes and smiled, the way a man smiles when he already knows how the story ends. "Mrs. Holt," he said pleasantly, "there's no need for that." "I'll decide what there's need for on my own property." "Your property." He let the words sit there between them, like a stone dropped into still water. "Until Friday, yes, that's correct." She kept the gun level. Her shoulder ached from holding it. She'd been holding a lot of things since Robert died. The farm, the debt, the silence of neighbors who used to wave from their porches and now found reasons to look the other direction when she rode into Cutter's Creek. Holding things was what she did now. She'd gotten very good at it. $340, she said. "That's what Robert borrowed. I've paid back $260. I have $80 left on that note, Mr. Voss. $80. Plus interest accrued since the date of default, which brings the balance to—" "I know what it brings it to." She took a step closer. "I also know that note was written with a 30-day cure period. I have until Friday. That's 3 days. Voss tilted his head, like a man entertaining a child's argument. "Mrs. Holt, this land sits on the only reliable water source between here and the ridge. You understand that it's not personal. It's simply that certain parties have plans for this region, and a widow holding 40 acres alone is—" "Finish that sentence," Maggie said, "and I promise you I will finish something else." He studied her for a long moment. She studied him back. Then he gathered his reins, turned his horse with the unhurried ease of a man who knew he could afford patience, and rode back down the dirt track toward the road without another word. Maggie lowered the gun. Her hands started shaking again only after he was gone. She stood there in the morning dust, the revolver hanging loose at her side, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of trembling before she pulled it back in. She'd learned that from 4 years of teaching school in Abilene before she'd married Robert. 30 seconds was enough to feel something. After that, you kept moving. The boots on the porch steps hit her like a second shot. She spun around, gun back up, and found a man standing at the far end of her porch she'd never seen before. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a trail-worn coat the color of dry grass, holding his hat in both hands in front of him. He hadn't drawn. He hadn't moved. He was watching her with dark eyes that weren't afraid of the gun and weren't pretending not to notice it either. "I'm not with him," the man said. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am. Name's Elias Drummond. I run the Drummond spread, north side of the Palo Duro, about 14 miles out." He nodded his chin toward the road where Voss had gone. "I've been watching Harlan Voss work this county for 3 years. I know how he moves. I came to talk to you before he got here, but I was late." He paused. "I'm sorry for that." Maggie didn't lower the gun. What do you want? To offer you a way to keep your land. I already have a way. I have $80 of it figured out and 3 days to find the rest. You don't have the rest. Her jaw tightened. You don't know that. I know Cutter's Creek, Elias said. I know that Nora Caldwell is the only neighbor within 10 miles who still speaks to you. And Nora doesn't have it to lend. I know the bank already turned you down for a short note last month. I know Voss has been buying up deeds on this side of the county for 2 years. And every time a property falls behind, suddenly nobody in town can spare the cash to help. He looked at her steadily. He's been manufacturing your isolation, Mrs. Holt. That's not bad luck. That's a plan. The gun stayed up, but something shifted behind her eyes. How do you know all that? Because he tried the same thing with me 4 years ago. He put his hat back on his head, settling it deliberately. Didn't work out the way he planned. I'd like to see it not work out for him again. Maggie lowered the gun to her side. She didn't put it away. Talk, she said. He sat down on the porch step without being invited. Not presumptuous, just practical. A man who'd been standing in the saddle since before sunrise. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked out toward the pasture rather than at her, which she noticed and appreciated. I need a school teacher, he said. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't that. Excuse me? My son Jesse is 16. He reads at a 10-year-old's level, and that's being generous. His mother left 4 years ago, and the school in Cutter's Creek closed the spring after that, when the teacher got married and moved to Amarillo. He turned to look at her. I heard you taught school in Abilene before you came out here. I heard you were good at it. You're offering me a job tutoring your son. I'm offering you more than that. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it out toward her. Read it before you say no. She crossed the porch and took it, unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was plain and careful, and what it said was not at all what she was prepared for. It was a contract. The terms were written out in straightforward language, with none of the curling legal obscurity she'd come to associate with Harlan Boss's documents. Elias Drummond proposed to pay the remaining balance on her note, the full amount, with interest, in cash, by Thursday morning. In exchange, Margaret Holt would come to the Drummond Ranch for a period of no less than 90 days, serving as tutor to Jesse Drummond and assisting in the management of the household. At the end of 90 days, both parties would have the right to terminate the arrangement or renegotiate its terms. Her farm would remain in her name throughout. There was a clause about that, underlined. She read it twice. Then she looked up at him. This says you'll pay my debt and my farm stays mine. That's correct. That's not a job offer. That's a rescue. It's a business arrangement, Elias said. I need help I don't have. You need money you don't have. Neither of us is getting something for nothing. If I walk away in 90 days, you're out $400 and nothing to show for it. Jesse might read better. That'd be something. He looked away again. He's angry, Mrs. Holt. Angry in the way that boys get when they think nobody sees them. I know how to work cattle. I know how to fix fence and read weather and get a calf on the ground in a blizzard. What I don't know is how to reach a 16-year-old boy who looks at me like I'm the reason everything went wrong. He was quiet for a moment. I thought maybe someone who knows how to teach things might know how to reach things. I might be wrong about that, but I'm out of other ideas. Maggie folded the paper again and held it between both hands, looking down at it. The morning was heating up around them, the sky turning that particular white-blue that meant another scorching day ahead. Somewhere in the back pasture, her single remaining cow was making her feelings known about the state of the water trough. You said his mother left, Maggie said carefully. Why? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "She wanted a different kind of life. I wasn't willing to give up the ranch to get it for her." That's the short version. What's the long version? He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down, and she saw something in his face that she recognized. Not grief exactly, but the particular flatness that comes after grief has finished with you and left behind only the facts. The long version is that I was too proud and too stubborn to hear what she was trying to tell me for 2 years before she left. By the time I understood it, she was already gone. He stood up. "I'm not telling you I'm an easy man to work for, Mrs. Holt. I'm telling you I'm a fair one. Those aren't always the same thing." Maggie looked at the paper in her hands. Then she looked at the road where Harlan Voss had disappeared. "I want to meet the boy before I agree to anything," she said. Something shifted in Elias Drummond's expression. Not a smile, it didn't go that far, but a slight easing, the way a man looks when he'd prepared himself for a harder fight and didn't get one. "That's fair," he said. "He's in the wagon." She blinked. "You brought him with you?" "Didn't want to make a decision about his life without him present for it." He paused. "He doesn't know that's why he's here. He thinks he's along to load feed from the mercantile. But he's here." Maggie almost smiled at that. Almost. She walked down the porch steps and around the side of the house, and there was the wagon. A solid, work-worn thing, hitched to a pair of good horses, and in it, sitting with his back against the sideboard and his arms crossed over his chest, was a boy who looked like he'd been constructed specifically to demonstrate what resentment looked like when it was young enough to still be sharp. He had his father's dark coloring and his father's straight back, but where Elias carried his tension in his jaw and his silence, this boy wore his right on the surface, raw and ready. He looked at Maggie with eyes that said he'd been told to be polite and had decided to interpret that as loosely as possible. "You're the school teacher," he said. "Former," Maggie said. "You're Jesse." "Yeah." He didn't move, didn't uncross his arms. "He tell you I don't need a teacher?" "He didn't mention your opinion on the subject." "Well, I'm mentioning it now. I'm 16. I can work a full day, same as any ranch hand on the spread. I don't need to sit inside reading primers." "I didn't say anything about primers." Maggie looked at him steadily. "What do you read?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What?" "What do you read? Books, papers, anything. What have you read that you actually wanted to read, not what somebody handed you?" Jesse's arms dropped an inch. "I don't... What does that have to do with anything?" "It has to do with whether there's a place to start," Maggie said. "A good teacher doesn't start with what a student can't do. She starts with what he already cares about." She tilted her head. "So, what do you care about?" He was looking at her differently now, not with less suspicion, but with a particular quality of suspicion that has been complicated by something unexpected. "Horses," he said finally. "Cattle work. Tracking." He paused. "Weather patterns. How to read them right. All of those require strong reading comprehension and basic mathematics," Maggie said. "So you do have a use for education. You've just been taught by people who couldn't show you what it was for." She looked back at Elias, who was standing a few feet back with his hat in his hands again. "That's fixable," she said. She turned back to the contract, read the underlined clause one more time. Her farm. Her name. 3 months, and she could come back and nothing would have changed, except the debt would be gone, and she'd have some ground under her feet to make her next decision from. "I have conditions," she said. Elias nodded once. "All right." "I tutor Jesse, but I decide how. You don't override my methods in front of him." If you have a problem with my approach, you say it to me privately." "Agreed." "I keep the deed to this farm in my possession at all times. Not in your safe, not in your foreman's lockbox. On my person." "I wouldn't have it any other way." "And if Harlan Voss comes to your ranch looking to cause trouble, for me or for you, you tell me about it immediately. No protecting me from information. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime." Something flickered across Elias Drummond's face at that, quick and gone before she could read it properly. "Agreed," he said. "All three." Maggie extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was steady and calloused and brief, the handshake of a man who meant what he said and wasn't in the habit of ornamenting it. "I'll pack tonight," she said. "I can be ready by morning." "I'll have the bank draft in your hands before noon tomorrow," Elias replied. "You can deliver it yourself if you want." "I do want." "Then we'll go together." He put his hat back on and moved toward the wagon seat. "Jesse, move up front." "I'm fine back here." "Jesse." The boy moved, but not without making his feelings about it visible in every motion. Maggie watched him settle onto the bench seat beside his father, with the particular posture of a young man who had decided that obedience and agreement were two entirely different things. She understood that feeling. She'd felt it herself for 4 years, sitting across a dinner table from a man who'd borrowed against her future and called it providing. She went inside and began to pack. The house felt smaller when she moved through it with intention, with the knowledge that she was leaving it rather than simply living in it. She'd hung her own curtains in this kitchen. She'd replastered the wall beside the window where the mud had cracked. She'd planted the 4 roses along the south fence herself, in the spring after the funeral, because she'd needed something to do with her hands that wasn't crying. She was not going to lose this place. She folded her 2 good dresses and her warmest shawl and the primer she'd kept from her teaching years, and she placed Robert's revolver in the bottom of the bag beneath everything else, wrapped in the shirt she'd been using as a cleaning cloth. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote out a letter to Nora Caldwell in the careful, even hand she'd spent years developing for the chalkboard. "Nora, I've made an arrangement. Will explain when I can. The farm is not lost. Keep an eye on the roses if you're able. Back in 90 days or thereabouts. Don't let Voss tell you otherwise. M." She sealed it and set it beside the lamp where the neighbor boy who collected eggs twice a week would find it in the morning. Then she blew out the lamp and sat in the dark kitchen for a few minutes, listening to the house settle around her the way it always did at the end of the day. She thought about what Elias Drummond had said. He'd been manufacturing your isolation. She thought about the months since Robert's funeral, about the way invitations had stopped coming and conversations had gotten shorter, about how she'd told herself it was grief making her see slights where there were only coincidences. She thought about Harlan Voss's patient smile from horseback and felt the cold clarity of understanding settle over her like a second skin. It hadn't been grief. She'd been right. And she'd been alone in knowing it, which was almost worse. She picked up her bag. Outside, the night was vast and hot and full of the particular silence of the Texas Panhandle. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of so much sky that sound got lost in it. She stood on the porch one more time and looked out at the dark shapes of her pasture, her fence line, her 4 roses invisible in the dark, but there. Hers. She was going to keep them. She walked to the small barn, settled her horse for the night with fresh water and an extra measure of feed, and told him she'd be back. "You always talk to that horse?" said a voice from the shadows. She grabbed for the revolver before her brain caught up with her reflexes, and told her it was the boy. Jesse, sitting on the fence rail with his boots hooked over the lowest board, watching her with what might have been curiosity if it hadn't had so much armor on it. "What are you doing here?" she said. "Your father's wagon is half a mile down the road." "He sent me back," Jesse shrugged. "Said I should offer to help you with your horse." He paused. "I don't actually know why you'd need help with your own horse. I think he just wanted me out of the wagon." Maggie looked at him. In the dark, without the full force of his daytime defensiveness, he looked younger. Just a boy, sitting on a fence in the middle of the night because his father had sent him somewhere, and he hadn't known how to refuse. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You're going to anyway." "Why are you angry at him?" The question landed, and he didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his boots for a moment, then back up at the sky. "You don't know anything about my family," he said. "No," Maggie agreed, "but I'm about to spend 90 days in it. I'd rather know the truth going in than learn it sideways." Jessie was quiet. She waited, giving him the space that she'd learned years ago that students needed when they were deciding whether to trust. "He let her leave," he said finally. "My mother. She asked him to choose, and he chose the ranch, and she left, and he let her go. Like she wasn't worth fighting for." His voice had gone flat in the particular way that means it was once something else. "And then he just kept working, like nothing happened, like she didn't matter." "Did she ask you to go with her?" He looked up sharply. Nobody had ever asked him that directly. She could see it on his face. "Yeah," he said, after a moment. "She did." "Why did you stay?" The longest silence yet. The horse shifted in the stall behind her. Somewhere, out on the flats, something called once and went quiet. "Because somebody had to," Jessie said. Maggie looked at him, this 16-year-old boy who had decided at 12 that he was the one responsible for holding something together, and felt the recognition move through her like a current. She'd been teaching long enough to know that the angriest students were almost always the ones who'd taken on the most. "That was a brave thing to do," she said, "and a hard one." He looked like he'd been expecting an argument and didn't know what to do without one. "It was stupid," he said. "It was both," Maggie replied. She picked up her bag. "Tell your father I'll be ready at first light." She walked back toward the house, and behind her, she heard Jesse drop down from the fence rail, his boots hitting the ground with the solid thud of someone who was heavier than he used to be, and hadn't quite gotten used to it yet. "Mrs. Holt," he said. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the yard, hat in his hands in exactly the same posture as his father, and for a moment, the similarity was so complete that it stopped her cold. "I'm not going to make this easy," he said. Not a threat, just a fact, offered plainly. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." He stood there for another moment. Then he put his hat back on and walked toward the road. Maggie went inside and did not sleep for a very long time. She lay in the dark and thought about 90 days, about a boy who'd stayed because somebody had to, about a man who'd been manufacturing her isolation for reasons that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with water rights and land value and the quiet violence of paperwork. She thought about Elias Drummond's hands on the contract, writing out the clause in plain language, her farm, her name. And she thought about Robert, who had never once written anything down in plain language in his life. She thought about what Elias had said. "I know how to work cattle. What I don't know is how to reach a 16-year-old boy who looks at me like I'm the reason everything went wrong." She knew what that looked like. She'd seen it in classrooms for 4 years before she'd ever seen it in the mirror. At some point before dawn, she stopped thinking and started sleeping. And when the first gray light came through the window, she rose, dressed in her plainest and most practical clothes, and was standing on her porch with her bag at her feet when Elias Drummond's wagon turned onto her road right at the moment the sun broke over the eastern flats. He pulled up in front of the porch and looked down at her. "You ready?" he said. Margaret Holt picked up her bag. "I've been ready," she said, "since before you got here." The ride into Cutter's Creek took just under an hour, and they didn't fill it with unnecessary conversation. That suited Maggie. She'd spent enough of her life around people who talked to avoid thinking, and she'd learned to measure a person's character partly by what they could stand to leave unsaid. Elias Drummond, it turned out, could leave quite a lot unsaid. He drove with his eyes on the road, and his thoughts somewhere she couldn't see. And Jesse sat in the wagon bed behind them, with his hat pulled low, and his arms crossed in the posture that Maggie was already beginning to recognize as his default position in the world. It was Jesse who spoke first. "You really gonna walk into Voss's bank and hand him the money yourself?" "That's the plan," Maggie said. "He's not gonna like that." "I'm not doing it so he'll like it." She heard something that might have been a short laugh from the wagon bed. Elias didn't react, but she thought she saw the line of his jaw shift slightly. The bank was on the main street of Cutter's Creek, between the land office and the dry goods store, and it had the particular solidity of buildings constructed by men who wanted other men to feel small standing in front of them. Maggie had felt small in front of it twice already. Once when she'd applied for the short note and been turned down, and once when she'd come to ask for an extension and been told there was nothing to discuss. She didn't intend to feel small in front of it again. Elias tied the horses and handed her the bank draft without ceremony, as he'd promised. She looked at the figure. The full amount, interest included, written in that same plain, careful hand. She folded it once and put it in the pocket of her coat. "You want company?" Elias asked. "I want witnesses," she said. "There's a difference." He nodded and fell into step beside her. Jesse, without being asked, dropped down from the wagon and came along, which Maggie noted and filed away. Harlan Voss was behind the counter when they walked in, speaking to a clerk in a low voice. He looked up when the door opened, and his expression went through three things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then the smooth pleasantness that was his public face, settling back into place like a mask being resettled after a near fall. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I didn't expect to see you until Friday." "I'm here today." Maggie put the bank draft on the counter between them. "Full balance, interest included. I'd like a receipt and the deed returned to me before I leave this building." Voss looked at the draft. Then he looked at Elias standing beside her, and something moved through his eyes that was colder and more honest than anything else on his face. "Mr. Drummond," he said, "I wasn't aware you and Mrs. Holt were acquainted." "We are now," Elias said. Voss picked up the draft and examined it with the deliberate slowness of a man deciding how much of his displeasure to make visible. The clerk beside him had gone very still. "This is all in order," Voss said finally. His tone hadn't changed, but the pleasantness had been excised from it, leaving something thinner. "I'll have Carver pull the deed from the file." "I'll wait," Maggie said. They waited. Nobody spoke. Jesse stood slightly behind and to Maggie's left, and she was aware of him watching Voss with an expression she recognized. The particular alertness of someone who'd been told to distrust a person and was now in the process of forming his own opinion about whether that distrust was warranted. When the deed came back, it was in a plain envelope, her name written across the front in the bank's formal script. She opened it, read it, and put it in her coat pocket with the same deliberateness with which she'd laid down the draft. Then she looked at Harlan Voss directly. "Thank you," she said. "I won't be needing your services again." Voss smiled. "I do hope you know what you're getting into, Mrs. Holt. Alliances out here can be complicated things. Not everyone who offers a hand is offering it freely." "Interesting advice," Maggie said, "from the man who's been quietly buying up every deed that fell behind payment in this county for 3 years." She held his gaze for one more moment. "Have a good morning," Mr. Voss?" She walked out. She heard Elias and Jesse behind her because she already knew he was. On the boardwalk, Jesse let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a while. "That was something," he said. "It was necessary," Maggie replied. "There's a difference between those two things as well." She thought she heard Elias make a sound low in his throat that might have been agreement. The road north out of Cutter's Creek changed character after the first 3 miles. The flat scrub of the town outskirts giving way to the rolling country that built gradually toward the canyon country further north. Maggie hadn't been in this part of the Panhandle before. She'd come to her farm from the east, following Robert's plan, which she'd trusted, because trusting had seemed, at the time, like the reasonable thing to do with a plan someone else had made. She'd been many reasonable things, once. She was less interested in reasonable now. "How many hands do you run?" she asked Elias. 6 regular season, 4 in winter. Good men. They know you're coming." "What do they know about why?" He glanced at her. "That I needed help with the household and Jesse's education. That's the truth, so that's what I told them." "And what did they think about it?" "2 of them thought it was a fine idea. One of them kept his opinion to himself, which is the best thing Cade Davis has ever done in his life. The 4th one asked if you could cook, and when I said I didn't know, he said he'd pray about it." Jesse made a sound from the back. That was Pete. "Pete prays about everything," Elias said. "Does it help?" "The biscuits have been terrible since Ma left," Jesse said. "So, probably not." Maggie turned halfway in the seat to look at him. He was looking at the horizon with his hat tipped back, and there was something looser in him out here on the road than there'd been in town. The armor wasn't gone, but it had shifted, given him more room to breathe inside it. He caught her looking and tipped the hat forward again. "I can cook," Maggie said. "I can also teach. Whether I do both or only one depends on what's actually needed and what's only assumed to be needed. Those aren't always the same." "You say that a lot," Jesse said, "that things aren't the same as each other. Because people assume sameness where there isn't any, and it causes most of the trouble I've ever seen." He thought about that for a minute. She let him. "What kind of trouble did it cause you?" he asked. "Jesse," Elias said, with a particular parental tone that means the question was too personal, and the parent isn't certain whether to be glad or sorry it was asked. "It's all right," Maggie said. She considered for a moment what to give him and what to hold back, and decided that the same standard she'd applied last night applied now. He'd be living around her truth for 3 months, and she'd rather he know the shape of it than invent something worse. "My husband borrowed money against our property and didn't tell me. I assumed we were partners. We weren't. Those 2 things weren't the same, and I didn't find out until it was almost too late." Jesse was quiet. "That's a bad kind of finding out," he said finally. "Yes," Maggie agreed. "It is." The Drummond Ranch came into view in the early afternoon. Not a subtle arrival, the way the foothills of the Walker country folded gently into view, but a direct confrontation, the house and the barn and the outbuildings sitting square and purposeful in the middle of open ground, like they'd been planted there with the specific intention of not being missed. The main house was long and low, built from timber and native stone, with a covered porch along the front and a second structure attached at the back that looked like it had been added on some years after the original. The barn was enormous. The corral beside it held 4 horses, who came to the fence line when the wagon approached, and a 5th horse, who stayed where he was, and watched with the self-possessed dignity of an animal that had decided long ago that enthusiasm was beneath him. "That's General," Jesse said, noticing her look. "He does that. He's not unfriendly, he's just—" "Selective," Elias said. "I was going to say stubborn," Jesse said. "Those aren't the same thing," Maggie said, and Jessie looked at her for a beat, and then made the sound again, low and quick, and this time she was certain it was a laugh. The ranch hand who came out of the barn when they pulled in was a compact, weathered man in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for so long it no longer distinguished between expressions. He looked at Maggie with frank assessment that wasn't unfriendly and wasn't pretending to be something else. "This is Cade Davis," Elias said. "He runs the day crew." "Ma'am," Cade said with a nod. "Mr. Davis," Maggie said, "I understand you had reservations." Cade glanced at Elias, then back at her. "I had questions," he said carefully. "What were they?" He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Whether you knew what you were walking into," he said, "and whether the boy was consulted." "The boy was present," Jessie said from the wagon. "The boy was there," Cade said, not looking at him, still looking at Maggie. "That's not the same as consulted." "No," Maggie agreed, "it's not. Those are good questions, Mr. Davis. The answer to the first is that I know enough to start, and I'll learn the rest. The answer to the second is that Jessie and I have spoken, and we've agreed that we're not going to make things easy for each other, which I find more honest than most agreements I've been party to." Cade was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," he said, and moved to help with the horses. The inside of the house was what she'd expected, and worse. Not dirty. Someone had been keeping it cleaned in the perfunctory way of people who cleaned because neglect was embarrassing rather than because order mattered to them. But deeply, structurally disordered, the way a household gets when nobody is running it with any sustained attention. The kitchen had the particular chaos of a space where cooking happened out of necessity and was resented for it. The main room had furniture in it, but no arrangement, pieces pushed to walls and angles that served no purpose except not being in the way. There were books on a shelf near the window, which surprised her, and she moved toward them instinctively. "Those were my wife's," Elias said from behind her. She stopped with her hand an inch from the spines. "Should I leave them?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "Read them if you want. Jessie should read them. That's what they're for." She pulled one out, a novel she recognized, one she'd taught from, and put it back. There'd be time for that. "Where do you want me?" she asked. Elias showed her to a room at the back of the added-on section. It was private and had its own window and was furnished simply with a bed and a chest and a washstand, and it was clear from the small accumulated details, a hook on the wall at the wrong height, a faded mark on the floor where a different piece of furniture had once stood, that it had been somebody else's room before it was nobody's. "Whose was this?" she asked. "It was meant to be a guest room," Elias said. "We didn't get many guests." She put her bag on the bed. "I'll start with Jessie tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock, main room, before the outdoor work starts. If I try to teach him after a full morning in the saddle, I'll lose him." "You'd know better than me." "I'd know better than you about teaching," she said, turning to face him. "You'd know better than me about most everything else here. I want us to be clear about that boundary, so we don't spend the first month arguing about it." He looked at her with that same quality of attention he'd had on her porch, considering, without the deflection that most men used when a woman said something direct. "Agreed," he said. "And I want to know about Voss, everything you know. Not the summary you give people you're trying not to worry, the actual situation." Something in his expression shifted. Not reluctance, but a kind of careful choosing. He moved to the doorway and leaned against the frame, his arms folded, looking at the floor for a moment before looking at her. "Voss wants the land along the west fork of the creek. My land borders it on 2 sides. Your land sits on the only other water access point in that stretch. He's been working toward controlling that whole corridor for 3 years. Your husband's death accelerated his timeline on your property because you were alone and unconnected. And now I'm connected to you," Maggie said. which is going to make him move differently. Not stop, move differently. He'll look for another way at it. Elias's jaw was set. I want you to know that before you settle in and get comfortable. You're safer here than you were alone, but I'm not promising you safe. I didn't ask for safe, Maggie said. I asked for honest. He looked at her for a moment. You're going to be hard to manage, he said, and the way he said it didn't sound like a complaint. I'm not asking to be managed, she said. That's also not the same thing. She heard Jesse in the hallway before she saw him. The particular sound of a person who'd stopped walking to listen, and then decided it was too late to pretend he hadn't been. He appeared in the doorway behind his father with his hat off, and an expression that was working hard to look like he'd just been passing by. "Dinner," he said. "Pete says it's ready." "Tell him we'll be there," Elias said. Jesse disappeared. Elias straightened from the doorframe and looked at Maggie once more. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't usually explain myself to people I've just met." "I noticed that," Maggie said. "I'm telling you because you should know who you're dealing with, not because it's comfortable." "I know who I'm dealing with," Maggie said. "A man who drove 14 miles in the early morning to offer a stranger a fair contract, wrote the terms in plain language, and brought his son along so the boy would be present for a decision about his own life." She held his gaze. "I can work with that man, Mr. Drummond. What I can't work with is one who'd have done all that and then decided to protect me from information." He was quiet for a moment. "Elias," he said. She looked at him. "If we're going to be under the same roof for 3 months," he said, "you should call me Elias." Maggie picked up her coat from the bed and draped it over the chair. "All right," she said. "Elias." They went to dinner, and Pete's biscuits were, in fact, terrible. And when Maggie said she'd take over breakfast in the morning, Pete looked at her with the expression of a man receiving unexpected news that he had not been wrong to pray for. And Jesse looked at his plate, and Cade Davis made a sound into his coffee that might have been a laugh. And Elias said nothing at all, but the corner of his mouth moved in a direction it hadn't moved since she'd arrived. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds, Maggie thought about the deed in her coat pocket, the draft she'd laid down on Voss's counter, the look on Jesse's face when she'd asked him why he'd stayed. She thought about the way Elias had said, "I'm not promising you safe," like it was something he needed her to carry without flinching. She thought about the fact that she was 60 miles from her own house, in a stranger's spare room, having handed her immediate future to a man she'd known for less than 24 hours, in exchange for the chance to save what she'd spent 4 years trying to hold together. She thought about whether that was brave or just desperate. She decided it was probably both, and went to sleep. The first morning of lessons did not go well. Jesse was at the table at 8 o'clock, which was something. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression Maggie was coming to think of as his natural resting position. And when she put a book in front of him, he looked at it the way a man looks at a fence post that has fallen across a road. Not with anger exactly, but with the flat acknowledgement of an obstacle that was going to cost him time. "We're not starting with the book," Maggie said. He looked up. She pulled the book back and sat down across from him. "Tell me about the weather patterns you mentioned, the ones you said you could read." Jesse uncrossed his arms by about half an inch. "What about them? How do you know what's coming? What do you look for?" He studied her for a moment, deciding whether this was a trick. Then something shifted, and he started talking. And once he started, she understood immediately why his reading level had nothing to do with his intelligence. He described cloud formations with precision and used compass directions without thinking about it. And when he talked about the relationship between wind shift and incoming storms, he was using the vocabulary of someone who'd been paying close attention to the natural world for years, without anyone ever telling him that what he was doing was a form of science. "You just described barometric pressure change," Maggie said when he paused. "Without using the term. Do you know what barometric pressure is?" "No."
"Do you want to?" He looked at the book she'd pulled back.
"Is it in there?" "It's in here." She tapped the side of her head. "I'll tell you about it, and then we'll find it in the book together so you can read it in someone else's words, and then you'll know it from two directions instead of one. That's how information sticks." Jessie was quiet for a moment. "That's not how they taught at the school in town." "I know. That's why you stopped going." He looked at her sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because boys who are bad at reading don't usually know how to track weather systems. That means the problem was never with your mind. It was with the method." She opened the book to the index and turned it toward him. "Find barometric. It'll be under B." He found it. It took him longer than it should have, his finger moving along the page with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd been embarrassed by this process before. But he found it, and when she had him read the entry aloud, he stumbled on two words and pushed through without stopping, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of student he actually was under the armor. "Huh," he said when he'd finished. "What?" "That's what I've been watching. I just didn't know it had a name." "Most things you already know have names," Maggie said. "Part of what I'm going to teach you is the names. The rest you already have." He looked at her with an expression that was still guarded, but had something working underneath it that wasn't hostility. "Why does it matter, knowing the name?" "Because knowing the name means you can talk to other people about it, write about it, read what other people have figured out about it. Names are how knowledge gets shared, instead of staying locked up in one person's head." She leaned forward slightly. "You've been watching those skies for years, Jessie. You've probably figured out things about this particular stretch of country that aren't written anywhere. That's worth something. But only if you can get it out of your head and into a form that lasts." He was looking at the book again, but differently now. Not at it as an obstacle, but as something that contained things he might actually want. It was a small shift. She'd learned not to call attention to small shifts, because doing so usually caused them to retreat. They worked for 2 hours. By the end of it, he'd read 4 pages with only occasional help, written out a weather observation in his own words that was rough but complete, and learned 3 terms he immediately started using in conversation, the way newly acquired vocabulary always got tested, slightly too frequently, with a carefulness that was trying not to look careful. When Elias came in from the morning's work and found them still at the table, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene with the expression of a man who had genuinely not been certain this would happen. Jessie noticed and immediately sat back, the armor reasserting itself in the automatic way of someone who'd learned that being seen doing something that mattered made it vulnerable. "Barometric pressure," Jessie said, too casually. "That's a real thing, apparently." "I know what it is," Elias said, pouring coffee. "Did you know I've been reading it my whole life without knowing the name?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "You've always been good at weather," he said. "I figured you'd picked it up watching the hands." "I figured it out myself," Jessie said. The edge in it was light but present. "I know you did." Elias looked at him directly. "That's what I meant." The silence between them had a texture to it that Maggie recognized. The particular tension of 2 people who had things to say to each other, and had been not saying them for so long that the unsaid things had taken up permanent residence in every room of the house. She stood up and began clearing the table, which was both useful and a quiet announcement that she wasn't going to watch them navigate it. "Lunch is on the stove," she said. "I'll be back at 8 tomorrow, Jessie." "I know," he said. She went outside and found Cade Davis repairing a bridle near the barn. He looked up when she came out and went back to his work with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had learned to do two things at once. "How'd it go?" he asked.
Better than expected.
"That boy is smart," Cade said. "Anybody with eyes can see it. Problem is, smart boys who aren't taught right figure out pretty quick that the people teaching them don't actually know them. Then they stop listening." "He stopped listening a long time ago," Maggie said. "He just hasn't stopped watching." Cade glanced at her. "He watches his father a lot." "I know." "Elias doesn't see it. He thinks Jesse looks at him to check what he's doing wrong. Doesn't realize the boy is looking to see what he's doing right, too." Cade pulled a length of leather through the buckle with practiced ease. "I've been working for Elias Drummond for 11 years. He's the best man I know at running cattle, and the worst I know at saying what he means to the people who need to hear it. Those two things have been fighting each other since long before his wife left." Maggie looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked the right questions yesterday," he said, "and because somebody ought to." It was 2 days later that Harlan Voss made his next move, and it came not in the form of a direct confrontation, but in the form of a letter. It arrived with a weekly mail run, addressed to Elias, and he read it at the kitchen table that evening, after the hands had eaten and Jesse had gone to his room, and only Maggie was still at the table, working on the mending she'd taken up, because the household's clothing situation was nearly as disordered as everything else. She watched his face change while he read. Not dramatically. Elias Drummond's face didn't do dramatic. But there was a hardening around the eyes, and a stillness in his jaw that told her the letter was not routine. Before he'd finished the first paragraph, he put it down on the table without comment. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him deciding, and she held his gaze and waited, because she'd told him what she needed, and she wasn't going to ask twice. He slid the letter across to her. It was from a land attorney in Amarillo, representing a consortium of investors, unnamed, who had recently acquired the note on a property adjoining the Drummond Ranch. The letter was courteous and precise, and communicated in the manner of legal documents designed to be technically accurate while being emotionally devastating, that the property in question had been transferred in settlement of a debt, and that the new owners intended to exercise their rights regarding shared water access along the creek boundary, and that they would appreciate Mr. Drummond's cooperation in arranging a meeting at his earliest convenience. Maggie read it twice. "He bought a neighbor's debt," she said. "Patterson's place, west boundary. Ed Patterson's been struggling for 2 years. I knew Voss was circling him, but I didn't know he'd moved already." Elias's voice was level, in the deliberate way of a man keeping it level by choice. "That parcel controls access to the upper fork. If he restricts the water easement, my summer grazing gets cut by 1/3. Can he legally restrict it? With the right attorney and enough time, a man can do a lot of things legally." He took the letter back and folded it. "This isn't about Ed Patterson's land. It's about leverage. He wants me to come to the table short." "Or he wants you reactive," Maggie said. "He wants you to do something that gives him grounds to escalate." She thought about Voss's face in the bank, the way he'd looked at her, then at Elias, and recalculated. "He knows the direct approach on your property didn't work, so he's coming at the edges." Elias was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You've dealt with men like this before," he said. "I've dealt with one like this before, in a smaller way. Men who use paperwork and patience the way other men use fists." She met his eyes. "They're more dangerous because they leave you questioning yourself, wondering if you're overreacting, if maybe it's all coincidence and bad luck and not a plan at all." She paused. "It's always a plan." "I know it's a plan," Elias said. "What I don't know is how to counter it without playing into it. You don't counter it alone, Maggie said. That's what he's counting on. That you'll try to handle it yourself because that's what you do. And while you're handling this, he'll be moving somewhere else. Elias was quiet for a long time. The fire on the hearth had burned down to coals, and the room was settling into the particular intimacy of late evening in a house where two people have stopped being strangers, but haven't figured out yet what they are instead. You said you know the land records, Maggie said. The filings, the easements, the original survey lines. I know this county's records better than Voss's attorney does. Then we start there. We find out what he actually has, and what he's implying he has, and we find where the document doesn't say what he's suggesting it says. She straightened in her chair. I taught school for 4 years, Elias. I spent every day finding the gap between what a student thought they understood and what they actually understood. Legal documents aren't so different. The danger is almost always in the space between what's written and what's assumed. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention she was coming to know. Direct, undeflected, taking in what she'd actually said, rather than what he expected her to say. You'd look at them with me, he said. It wasn't quite a question. That's why you should be paying me more, she said, and something moved across his face that was as close to surprised as she'd seen him get. I can manage that, he said. They were still at the table at midnight, the letter and 3 years' worth of county survey records spread between them, when Jesse appeared in the hallway doorway in his nightclothes, hair disordered from sleep, looking at them with the baffled expression of someone who'd expected to find the house dark. What are you doing? He asked. Reading, Maggie said. At midnight? Turns out the same skills apply, she said, not looking up. Finding what's missing from the document. Finding what's there that wasn't put there by accident. Jesse stood in the doorway for a moment. Is it about Voss? Elias looked up at his son. How do you know about Voss? I'm 16, Pa. I'm not 8. Jesse crossed his arms, but it was a different posture than his usual armoring. There was something anxious underneath it. Ed Patterson's place. Cade told me today. He figured you'd tell me eventually, but he knows how long eventually takes with you. He looked at his father steadily. Is it bad? Elias was quiet for a moment, and Maggie watched him decide again. Watched him weigh the old habit of protecting against the newer understanding that protection and honesty were not the same thing. It's manageable, he said finally. We're working on it. We, Jesse said, looking from his father to Maggie and back. Yes, Elias said. Just the one word. Jesse stood there, absorbing this. Can I help? You can go to sleep, Elias said. You've got lessons in the morning. Jesse's jaw set, and Maggie saw the familiar retreat starting, the closing off, the deciding that this was another version of being kept outside the circle. She spoke before it could complete. Jesse, she said, the Upper Fork easement. It runs along the north boundary of your summer grazing, doesn't it? You'd know that land. He looked at her. Yeah, I've ridden it 100 times. Tomorrow morning, after lessons, I want you to draw me a map of it. Not from the survey, from memory. Every marker you can remember, every place the terrain changes, every spot where the water access matters. She held his gaze. The legal documents tell us what's written. You can tell us what's true. Those aren't always the same thing. Jesse stood still for a moment. Then something in his shoulders came down by a fraction that had nothing to do with the hour. Yeah, he said. All right. He went back to his room. Elias was watching the empty doorway for a moment after he'd gone. You do that on purpose, Elias said. Do what? Give him a task that matters. Make him part of the thing instead of outside it. He was quiet. I never figured out how to do that. Maggie looked back at the records in front of her. He stays because he thinks somebody has to. Can do with a person like that is show them that staying is worth more than just holding something together. Show them it's actually building something. She found the line she'd been looking for in the survey document and put her finger on it. Here, this is the easement language. Read this clause and tell me if it says what boss's attorney says it says. Elias leaned forward and read. It doesn't, he said. No, Maggie agreed. It doesn't. The relief in his face was brief and almost immediately replaced by something more complicated. Not just the practical satisfaction of finding a weakness in boss's position, but something that went deeper. The recognition that he'd been sitting alone with this problem, carrying it with the same solitary stubbornness he brought to everything, and that he was not, currently, sitting alone. He didn't say anything about that. She didn't either. But it was there in the room between them, as real as the documents on the table. There's more to check, he said. I know. They kept working. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, and somewhere on the south pasture, a coyote called once and went silent, and the fire in the hearth burned lower, and neither of them moved to add wood, because the table between them was warm enough. At some point past 1 in the morning, Nora Caldwell arrived. The knock at the door was loud and without ceremony. The knock of a woman who was not accustomed to people being asleep when she needed them. And Maggie reached the door before Elias because she was closer. Nora Caldwell came in with road dust on her coat and an expression on her face that had bypassed urgency and gone straight to the particular focused calm of someone who'd made the decision to act and was now past the point of second thoughts. I rode from my place, she said, 8 miles in the dark, because I don't trust a message to wait until morning. She looked at Maggie first, then at Elias coming up behind her. Voss had a conversation today at the saloon, loud enough that 3 people heard it, and 2 of them came to find me before sunset. She pulled off her gloves. He's not going after the water easement, Elias. That's the distraction. He's going after Margaret. The room went very still. What do you mean? Maggie said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was something she was grateful for. He's been asking questions about your husband's death, Nora said. Not grief questions. Legal questions. Whether the death was properly investigated. Whether there are questions about the property transfer, and who had knowledge of what when. She met Maggie's eyes directly, with the unflinching practicality of a woman who'd learned that the truth delivered quickly was kinder than the truth drawn out. He's building a story, Margaret. I don't know yet what the story is, but it's about you. Maggie heard Elias move behind her, not toward Nora, not toward the door, but closer to her, a shift of weight and position that was too deliberate to be unconscious. What kind of story? Elias said, and his voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard it go before. Not loud, not sharp, but with something underneath it that was both cold and very certain. The kind a man builds, Nora said, when he wants a woman discredited before she becomes a problem. Nora stayed the night. There wasn't a discussion about it. She'd ridden 8 miles in the dark, and the road back wasn't safer for being made in the small hours. And Nora Caldwell was not the kind of woman who required persuading to accept practical hospitality. Elias gave her his room without ceremony and went to sleep on the pallet in the main room. And Maggie lay in her bed in the back room, staring at the ceiling, and thinking about what kind of story a man builds when he wants a woman discredited before she becomes a problem. She thought about Robert, about the mortgage papers under the floorboards, about the 4 years she'd spent believing she understood what her life was, and then the 2 months she'd spent learning she'd been wrong about almost all of it. She thought about what pieces of those 4 years could be reshaped in the telling, what could be made to look like something other than what it was, in the hands of someone who was skilled at reshaping and motivated to do it quickly. The answer, she knew, was most of it. She rose before dawn and was making coffee when Elias came into the kitchen. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and they had the particular exchange that people have when they've both been awake most of the night with the same problem, and have arrived, separately, at the same understanding that whatever was going to happen next needed to happen before it was allowed to gather momentum. "Tell me what you know about how Robert died," he said. He said it quietly and directly, without preamble, which she appreciated. Not what happened, what Voss could do with what happened. Maggie poured 2 cups and sat down. Robert died of a fever in October. Dr. Sims came out twice. He signed the death certificate without question because it was a straightforward death, the kind that happens to men who don't rest when they should. She looked at her hands around the cup. There was no question about it at the time. There was no reason for one. But I found the mortgage papers 3 weeks later, and I went to Sims to ask about extending the payment timeline. And Sims had been the one who recommended Voss's bank to Robert in the first place. And he wasn't unkind about it, but he also wasn't helpful, and she stopped. And now I'm thinking about whether Sims and Voss have conversations I don't know about, and whether a doctor who recommended a bank to a client might also be willing to answer questions about that client's death in ways that make the answers useful to the bank. Elias was quiet for a moment. "That's how Voss works," he said. "He builds from existing material. He doesn't have to fabricate anything. He just has to ask the right questions to the right people and let their answers land wrong." "What questions is he asking?" "I don't know yet." Elias set down his cup. "But I know who will." "Nora?" "Nora knows what everyone in Cutter's Creek is saying within 12 hours of them saying it. She doesn't gossip. She archives." He looked at Maggie steadily. "We need to know the shape of it before it gets to the point where defending against it looks like guilt." Nora came in from the bedroom 20 minutes later, looking entirely alert, the way women of her generation and disposition came into rooms, ready, without apology for being so. She accepted coffee, sat down, and told them what she knew with the efficient economy of someone who understood that time spent getting to the point was time Voss was spending on something else. The story he was building, as best Nora could piece together from 3 separate conversations overheard in 3 separate locations across Cutter's Creek, was not a direct accusation. It was a series of questions, floated casually, designed to attach themselves to existing uncertainties, the way seeds attach to wool, without intention on anyone's part, but stubbornly and with consequence. Had anyone really looked into how quickly Mrs. Holt had found her financial footing after her husband's death? Was it not curious that a woman who'd claimed to have no knowledge of the mortgage had managed to locate the funds to repay it within weeks of it coming due? And wasn't it interesting that she'd done so through an arrangement with Elias Drummond, who had his own history with Voss's bank, and his own reasons for wanting to complicate that relationship? The implications were nowhere stated. They didn't need to be. "He's not accusing me of anything specific," Maggie said when Nora finished. "He's just making people wonder." "That's enough," Nora said flatly. "In a town this size, wonder does the same work as accusation and leaves him with clean hands." "What does he actually want?" Jesse's voice came from the hallway. He was standing in the doorframe, fully dressed, earlier than she'd ever seen him up, with an expression on his face that had moved past his habitual guardedness into something cleaner and colder. He'd been listening, and unlike the night before, he wasn't pretending otherwise. "Not the land, not the water rights. What does he actually want?" The 3 adults looked at him. Nobody told him to go back to bed. "He wants your father's cooperation on a land deal he can't finalize without it," Maggie said. "The water easement, the grazing access, the survey boundaries, They all converge on Drummondland in a way that means whatever Voss is building needs Elias either at the table or out of the way. Since Elias won't come to the staying out too high. She met Jesse's eyes. I'm the cost he's trying to raise. Jesse's jaw worked for a moment. So if you're discredited, then the arrangement between your father and me looks suspicious rather than legitimate. Your father's position weakens, and Voss gets to renegotiate from strength. She looked at him steadily. It's not personal, it's geometry. It feels personal, Jesse said.
I know, Maggie said. That's why it works.
Elias stood up from the table. I'm riding into Cutter's Creek today. His voice had the particular quality of a decision made in the night and arrived at, fully formed. I'm going to have a conversation with Harlan Voss directly. Not about the easement, about this. That's what he wants, Maggie said immediately. He wants you reactive. He wants you walking into his bank angry so he can be the reasonable one. I'm not going to be angry. Elias looked at her. I'm going to be clear. There's a difference between clear and reactive, and I believe you know that. But I'm coming with you. He looked at her for a moment. Maggie, don't, she said. It came out flat and certain, and she saw the word land on him. Don't manage this for me. Don't decide I should be handled carefully and kept back and protected from the conversation that's about me. I've had enough of decisions made about my life by people who thought they were doing me a kindness. The silence in the kitchen was complete for a moment. All right, Elias said. I'm coming too, Jesse said. No, both adults said at the same moment, with the same intonation. And Jesse looked between them with an expression that was almost worth the circumstances that had produced it. Fine, he said, but I want to know what happens. You'll know, Elias said. Everything. I'll tell you when we get back. Jesse looked at his father for a long moment, the particular look that Maggie had been watching him give Elias since she'd arrived, the one Cade had told her about, the one that was checking not just for failures, but for what was right. Whatever he found this time satisfied something, because he nodded once, a short and serious gesture that looked more like the acknowledgement between equals than the compliance between a boy and his father. I'll finish the map, he said, for the easement boundaries, in case you need it. Good, Maggie said. Nora rode with them as far as her own turnoff, and when she parted ways, she looked at Maggie from horseback with the direct, measuring gaze of a woman who'd been assessing people's readiness for difficult things for several decades. You know what you're walking into, she said. It wasn't a question. I know what I'm walking into, Maggie confirmed. Good, because Voss is going to look at you and see the woman who's supposed to be frightened by now, and finding out she isn't is going to make him do something he hasn't planned for. Nora gathered her reins. Make him show you what that is before you show him what you have. You understand me? I understand you. Elias, Nora looked at him. Don't talk first. Elias tipped his hat. Nora rode east, and they rode on toward Cutter's Creek. They didn't speak much on the road. There was a companionable quality to their silence now that hadn't been there 3 days ago, on the same road going the other direction. The silence of two people who had been working on the same problem in the same room at midnight, and had come out of it understanding each other differently. Maggie was aware of him beside her in the particular way she'd been aware of very few people in her life. Not romantically, not yet, or not in a way she was prepared to name, but as a presence that had weight and reliability and didn't require her to be smaller than she was in order to coexist with it. She'd spent 4 years coexisting with a man who'd needed her smaller. She hadn't known that's what she'd been doing until she'd stopped doing it. Harlan Voss was not in the bank. The clerk told them, with the careful neutrality of someone managing a situation he didn't fully understand, that Mr. Voss was at the land office, meeting with the county assessor. Maggie, and Elias walked to the land office. The conversation between Voss and the assessor, a thin, nervous man named Briggs, who had the look of someone who'd been uncomfortable in his own skin since birth, stopped when they came through the door. Voss turned. The calculation moved through his eyes faster this time. He'd been expecting a reaction, but not this quickly, and not this composed. "Mr. Drummond," he said. "Mrs. Holt. This is unexpected." "I doubt that," Maggie said pleasantly. "Mr. Briggs, would you excuse us for a few minutes? This concerns Mr. Voss specifically." Briggs looked at Voss. Voss gave him a small nod, and Briggs took his papers and removed himself to the anteroom with the relief of a man who'd been handed a legitimate reason to be elsewhere. Maggie was aware of the door closing behind him, aware of the changed quality of the room with only the three of them in it. "I understand you've been asking questions," she said. Voss spread his hands in the gesture of a man surprised by an unexpected accusation. "I've been having conversations, Mrs. Holt. It's a small town. People talk." "They do," Maggie agreed. "And what they talk about in a small town has consequences. You understand that better than most. It's why you use it." "I'm not sure I follow." "I think you follow perfectly." She took a step forward, not aggressive, measured, deliberate. The step of a woman who'd decided exactly how much ground she was willing to cede, and had found that the answer was none. "You're building a story. Not with lies. You're too careful for lies. With questions. With implication. With the kind of conversation that doesn't make accusations, but makes people wonder. And in wondering, do your work for you." She held his gaze. "I've seen it before, Mr. Voss. Smaller scale, different target. I know what it looks like, and I know what it's for." Voss's pleasant expression had become something thinner and more attentive. "You're a determined woman," he said. "I'll give you that." "You're going to give me more than that," Maggie said. "You're going to stop." A beat of silence. Or I start asking questions of my own." She kept her voice completely level. "About the Patterson note. Specifically about when it was acquired and what communications preceded the acquisition. About the timeline of your conversations with Dr. Sims relative to my husband's death. About the 3 other properties in this county that fell into default within 6 months of their owners having financial conversations with your bank." She paused. "I taught school for 4 years, Mr. Voss. I know how to research. I know how to find the pattern in the documents. And I know how to present what I find in a way that a county circuit judge would find legible." Voss was very still. Maggie had the sense of watching something recalibrate behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but the particular stillness of a man reassessing the weight of what he'd assumed was a manageable opposition. "You have no evidence of any wrongdoing," he said carefully. "I have the beginning of a very interesting set of questions," Maggie replied. "Which is exactly what you have about me. The difference is that I'm not planning to ask mine casually in saloons. I'm planning to put them in writing, with documentation, and deliver them to 3 specific people who have both the standing and the motivation to find the answers." She held his gaze one more beat. "We can both stop here, Mr. Voss. I have no interest in destroying you. I have an interest in keeping my land, and ensuring that my arrangement with Elias Drummond remains exactly what it appears to be, which is legitimate, contracted, and no business of yours." Voss looked at Elias for the first time since they'd walked in. Elias had not moved from the spot near the door where he'd positioned himself when they entered. He hadn't spoken. He stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes on Voss, with an expression that communicated with perfect efficiency that he had come with Maggie and not for her, and that the distinction was one Voss should understand. "You've made a choice in this, Drummond," Voss said. "I made it when I drove to her place," Elias said. "I'm comfortable with it." The silence in the room had a different quality now. The geometry had shifted, and all three of them knew it. Voss was still dangerous. Men like Voss didn't become less dangerous when their immediate plan was disrupted. They became more careful, which was its own kind of threat. But the specific attack he'd been building had been walked into and named in plain language, in a room with no witnesses except the people involved. And named things had less power than unnamed ones.
That was true of weather systems and true of men's intentions both.
"I'll need to think about this," Voss said finally. "Think about it carefully," Maggie said. "Take whatever time you need." She picked up her gloves from the desk where she'd set them. "Good day, Mr. Voss." They walked out. The sun on the main street of Cutter's Creek was bright and indifferent, and the morning was going on around them the way mornings do, regardless of what happens in land offices. Maggie walked to where the horses were tied and stood with her hand on the saddle for a moment, her back to Elias, and allowed herself 30 seconds of shaking, the way she always did after the thing was over, because during the thing she was steady, and after it she paid the price. Elias didn't say anything. He stood near his own horse and gave her the 30 seconds without comment, without looking away, without pretending not to see. When she turned around, his expression was the one she'd been cataloging since she arrived. Direct, undeflected, taking in what was actually in front of him rather than what he expected. But there was something added to it now that she hadn't seen before. "You walked in there with nothing," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was the statement of a man who'd watched something happen and was still working out what he'd seen. "I walked in there with questions," she corrected, "and the ability to make them sound like more than they are, which is exactly what he's been doing." She met his eyes. "I learned from the best, apparently." "Did you actually have documentation?" "I have the beginning of documentation," she said, "which is what I told him. I didn't lie. I just let him calculate the risk of finding out how much beginning I actually have."
Elias was quiet for a moment, and then he made the sound she'd only heard him make once before. Brief, low, startled out of him by something he hadn't been prepared for. It was, undeniably, a laugh. "Nora said to make him show you what he'd do when he wasn't prepared," Elias said. "I know. I was listening." "You were listening, and you were 2 steps ahead of that already." He looked at her for a moment, a long, serious look that wasn't the assessing look from the first day, or the careful look from the late nights at the table, but something else, something she recognized without being entirely ready to name. "Maggie, I need to tell you something." "All right." "When Nora said what she said last night, about him going after you," he stopped, started again. "I've been alone in this for a long time. Not because I preferred it, because the people who'd been here left, or because I'd handled things wrong enough that asking for help started to feel like proof of a failure I couldn't admit to." He looked at his hat in his hands. "What you did in there, the way you handled it, I wouldn't have thought of it. I would have gone in there angry and given him exactly what he wanted. And you knew that before I did." "You didn't go in angry," she said, "because you told me not to." "And you listened," she said quietly. "That's not a small thing, Elias. Men who are used to handling things alone don't listen easily. You did." He looked at her with that expression again, and this time she let herself look back at it without cataloging it, without filing it away in the careful ledger she'd been keeping since she arrived. It was something real and present and not yet named, and not needing to be named yet. And she was old enough now, and had been hurt enough now, to know that the unnamed thing was not less real for being unnamed.
It was just early. "Jesse's going to ask what happened," Elias said. "Then we should get back, so you can tell him." They rode back in the afternoon light, and the silence between them was different again. Layered now, carrying more than it had in the morning. Not heavier, but fuller. The way air gets before rain, when it's the good kind of rain that the land has been waiting for. When they rode into the yard, Jesse was on the porch with a piece of paper in his hand. The map, drawn in the careful, deliberate lines of someone who'd been paying attention to something for years, without knowing the name for what he was doing. He stood up when he saw their faces, and read them with the quick instinct he had for reading everything that wasn't on a page. "It worked," he said, not a question. "It worked," Maggie said. Jesse looked at his father. Something moved between them. Not words, not yet, but the possibility of words that hadn't existed 3 days ago. Jesse held out the map. "I marked every water point on the north boundary," he said. 7 of them. I don't think Voss's survey accounts for 2 of them." Elias took the map and looked at it. His son had drawn it in precise lines from memory. Every marker placed. Every terrain change noted in handwriting that was rough but legible. The handwriting of someone who'd been taught this week that the names for things mattered. "This is good work," Elias said. Jesse looked at him directly. "I know," he said. And for the first time since Maggie had arrived, the words didn't carry a challenge in them. They were just true, and Jesse had said them plainly, the way a person speaks when they've been seen clearly enough that they no longer need the armor of deflection. Maggie went inside to start dinner and left them on the porch with the map between them, because some conversations needed to happen without witnesses, and this was one of them. And she understood the difference between being part of a family and being in the way of one. In the kitchen, she could hear their voices through the open window, low and halting at first, and then a little less so. She didn't listen to the words. The quality of the sound was enough. She started the biscuits and thought about 90 days and how many of them were left, and what she was going to do when the number ran out. The 90 days didn't end the way Maggie had expected, which was fitting, because almost nothing about the Drummond Ranch had ended the way she'd expected since the morning she'd ridden through the gate with her deed in her coat pocket and her future undecided. It ended on a Tuesday in late November, with the first hard frost of the season silvering the grass, and Jesse reading aloud from a surveying manual at the kitchen table, while Maggie corrected the biscuits Pete had attempted, badly, again, with a determination she had come to find genuinely touching, and Elias coming in from the north pasture with mud on his boots, and the particular expression he wore when something had gone wrong with the cattle that he'd already fixed and wasn't going to mention unless she asked. She asked. "2 calves down in the creek hollow," he said, pulling off the boots at the door. "Cold got to them overnight. We moved the rest of the herd up before it could go further." "Were they the Henderson calves?" He looked at her. "How did you know about the Henderson calves? Jesse told me yesterday that Henderson's yearlings had been running with your herd along the north fence. I told him to tell you." She looked at Jesse. Jesse looked at the surveying manual with great concentration. "I forgot," he said. "You didn't forget," Maggie said. "You decided it wasn't urgent enough to interrupt him." Jesse's jaw moved. "It wasn't urgent yesterday." "It became urgent overnight," she said. Not harshly. She'd learned the precise register of directness that Jesse responded to without shutting down. The difference between accountability and attack. When you have information that affects animals or land, you pass it immediately, not when it's convenient. "I know," he said. He looked up at his father. "I should have told you. I'm sorry." Elias looked at his son with the expression Maggie had watched develop over 90 days from the locked, careful face of a man who didn't know how to be seen to something more open, not unguarded. Elias Drummond would never be unguarded. That wasn't his nature. But present in a way that registered. "We got to them," he said.
Next time you tell me.
Next time I tell you, Jesse agreed. It was such an ordinary exchange. That was what struck Maggie about it. It's ago. That same exchange would have had 3 times the silence and twice the tension, and ended with Jesse leaving the room and Elias standing in the kitchen alone, with the particular flatness of a man who'd tried and wasn't sure what he'd done wrong. Now they went straight through it and came out the other side with the easy practicality of people who'd learned to trust that the other one wasn't going anywhere. She'd done that. Not alone. They'd done it together, all 3 of them, but she'd been the one who'd understood what needed building and had known how to start. The thought of leaving sat in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its weight until she shifted position and felt it again. After dinner, after Jesse had gone to do the evening feeding, and Pete had retired to the bunkhouse with the philosophical resignation of a man who knew the biscuits would be taken from him again in the morning, Elias sat across from her at the kitchen table, with 2 cups of coffee between them, and said, without preamble, "Your 90 days end Thursday." "I know," Maggie said. "We haven't talked about it." No. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. This was the version of him she'd come to know best. Not the closed-off version from the first days, or the reactive version she'd pulled back from the edge of in Voss's land office, but the one who sat with difficult things long enough to understand them before he spoke. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said. "That's not what this is." "I know that too. But I want to say some things, and then you can say what you want, and we'll figure out what happens after that." He looked up at her. "All right?" "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, gathering himself. She'd learned that this was not hesitation. It was the opposite of hesitation. The deliberate collection of words by a man who used them carefully, because he knew their weight. "When I drove to your place 3 months ago," he said, "I told you I needed help I didn't have. That was true. But I didn't tell you everything I knew, which was that I've been watching you since before Robert died. Not—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Not the way that sounds. I'd heard about you. Nora talked about you. Said there was a woman on the eastern parcel who'd turned a half-ruined farm into something viable on her own. Who'd been quietly outmaneuvering a bad situation for 2 years without anyone helping her do it." He met her eyes. "I knew who you were before I knocked on your door. I chose you specifically." Maggie was very still. "You didn't mention that." "No, because if I'd said it that way, I've been watching you. I chose you specifically. It would have sounded wrong, and I couldn't figure out how to make it sound right. So I said what I could say, which was the true part about Jesse and the household." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "But I want you to know now, because you should know that what happened here, the way things changed, it didn't happen by accident. I came to your door because I believed you were the person who could do what needed doing. I was right. But somewhere in the middle of being right, something else happened that I wasn't planning for and wasn't expecting." "Elias," she said carefully. "Let me finish." He said it quietly, but with the certainty of a man who'd been not finishing sentences for too long and had decided to stop. "I'm not asking you to stay because you've been useful, or because Jesse needs you, or because the house runs better, even though all of those things are true. I'm asking you to stay because I don't want to sit at this table without you. Because you are the only person in my adult life who has walked into a room full of problems and looked at them as things to be solved, rather than reasons to leave. And I have spent years watching people choose leaving, and I—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "I don't want to watch you leave, Maggie. I want to watch you stay." The fire in the hearth settled with a soft sound. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and full of stars. The kind of night the Texas Panhandle produced in November that made the sky look like something intentional. Maggie looked at this man, this difficult, careful, deliberate man who drove 14 miles before dawn to offer a fair contract and wrote the terms in plain language and had been slowly, painfully, imperfectly learning for 3 months how to say what he meant to the people who needed to hear it. She thought about Thursday, about the deed in her coat pocket that had been there for 90 days, never far from her hand, the proof that she still had something of her own. She thought about the roses on the south fence of her farm, which Nora had written to say were dormant but alive, waiting. She thought about what it meant to have something of your own, and what it meant to be somewhere you chose, and whether those two things had to be in opposition, or whether there was another arrangement entirely. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "If I stay, not on a contract, not on 90 days, but actually stay, what does that mean? What are you asking me?" He looked at her directly. "I'm asking you to marry me." She'd known that was the answer. She'd known it was coming for 2 weeks, the way she knew weather was coming, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of signs. The shift in how he moved in a room she was in, the way he'd started holding the door of the barn for her with a small, unconscious courtesy that hadn't been there in the first weeks. The evening, 3 weeks ago, when he'd come in from a late ride and found her asleep at the table over the land records, and had put a blanket over her shoulders without waking her, and gone to bed himself. She'd known. She'd been deciding, and she'd been deciding for weeks. And she'd been afraid of the decision the way she was afraid of all decisions now. Not because she lacked courage, but because she'd spent 4 years in a marriage that had looked like one thing and been another. And the scar tissue from that was real and didn't dissolve just because the man across from her was different. "I need to tell you something too," she said. "All right. I came here on a contract because a contract felt safe. Terms I could see, an end date I could plan for." She looked at her hands. "Robert didn't give me terms. He made decisions and called them our decisions. And I found out the difference when it was almost too late to fix it." She looked up. "I'm not saying you're Robert. I know you're not. But the fear doesn't know that yet. The part of me that packed a bag and held a gun and drove into Cutter's Creek to put money on a counter myself. That part is still measuring the distance to the door, even when the rest of me knows I don't want to use it." "I know," Elias said. "You know?" "Cade told me. Or, he told me enough." He set down the coffee cup. "He said you check the deed in your coat pocket every morning, that you've been checking it since the day you arrived." He met her eyes, and there was nothing in his face but steadiness, not judgment, not impatience, just the quality of attention she'd come to rely on without realizing she was relying on it. "I don't want you to stop checking it. I want you to keep the deed, keep it in your pocket, keep your name on the property. If you marry me, your farm stays yours. Your name stays on it. Your decision about it stays yours." She stared at him. "You thought about this?" "I've thought about almost nothing else for 3 weeks," he said, with a dryness that was the closest thing he had to self-deprecating humor, and that she'd come to find, quietly and without announcement, one of her favorite things about him. "Papa's going to ask you tomorrow morning," Jessie said from the hallway. Both of them turned. Jesse was standing in the doorframe in his work coat, with hay on his sleeve, and the expression of a person who had been standing there for longer than was strictly defensible, and had decided that honesty was the better policy at this point. He told Cade 3 weeks ago, and Cade told Pete, and Pete has been praying about it, which is probably why it's gone this long without him just saying it already. "Jesse," Elias said, "I'm just saying the whole ranch knows, and I thought she should know we know," Jesse said. He looked at Maggie with the expression she'd watched develop from locked hostility to something she could only describe as the particular regard of a person who'd been surprised into care and was still slightly annoyed about it. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not just because of the lessons, even though I'm reading at grade level now, which Cade says is on account of you, but because you're—" He stopped, then pushed forward in the way he'd learned to push forward through the hard words. "You're the first person in a long time who told me the truth about things, when it would have been easier not to. I don't want to lose that." The stone in Maggie's chest shifted. "Come sit down," she said. Jessie came in and sat at the table, and the three of them were there together in the warm kitchen, with the fire and the coffee and the frost outside the windows. And Maggie looked at the two of them, the man who'd driven 14 miles in the dark to offer her a choice, and the boy who'd stayed because somebody had to, and felt the decision that had been assembling itself for weeks finally complete. "I have conditions," she said. Elias's mouth moved. "You always have conditions. My farm stays in my name. I handle the books for this property, not because you can't, but because I'm better at it and we both know it." "Agreed. Jesse and I keep our lesson time, not just through the winter, until he's ready for whatever he decides he wants to do next, whether that's this ranch or something else." Jesse looked up sharply. "Something else?" "You're 16, Maggie said. "You're smart and capable, and you've been making yourself small enough to fit inside this ranch because you were afraid that if you got too big for it, you'd leave. But staying should be a choice, not a default." She held his gaze. "I want you to have enough education that you could go anywhere and do anything. What you do with that is yours to decide. But I won't teach you to be only what you already are." Jesse was very still. Then something in him released, something deep and old, a held breath that had been held so long it had become structural. "All right," he said. It came out rough. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't need to. "Third condition," Maggie said, looking back at Elias. "Name it." "Nora Caldwell gets invited to the wedding, and she gets to sit in the front row, and nobody argues with her about anything on that day, regardless of what she says, because she rode 8 miles in the dark for me, and that deserves something." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "I would never argue with Nora Caldwell," he said. "I have more sense than that." "Then we're agreed," Maggie said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, the way he did everything, steadily, without excess, meaning exactly what the gesture said, and nothing it didn't. His hand was warm and calloused, and she thought about the first time she'd pressed a gun to Harlan Voss's chest in the early morning, and how alone she'd been standing there, and how different alone felt from this, and how she'd spent 4 years not knowing the difference because she'd never had the comparison. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." The wedding was small because everything on the Drummond Ranch was conducted with practical efficiency, and also because neither of them had any patience for ceremony beyond what the moment required. Nora Caldwell arrived the morning of in her best coat, with a bunch of dried wildflowers she'd kept from summer, which she gave to Maggie without sentiment, and with the instruction not to make a fuss about them. The ranch hands cleaned up with varying degrees of success. Pete prayed, which was expected. Cade stood beside Elias with the expression of a man who was genuinely happy and had no particular way of showing it beyond being present. Jesse stood beside Maggie. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply positioned himself there when the time came, in the unhurried way of someone who'd made a decision without needing to announce it. And when she'd looked at him, he'd look back with his father's directness and his own particular quality of hard-won steadiness and said, "Somebody should stand with you." And she had not trusted her voice sufficiently to reply. The circuit preacher who came through Cutter's Creek every 6 weeks had been prevailed upon to delay his departure by 1 day, and he read the words with the cadence of a man who'd spoken them many times and still believed in them. And when he asked Elias if he took this woman, Elias said yes, with the same quality of certainty he brought to everything. Not dramatic, not performed, just true. When he asked Maggie, she looked at the man beside her and at the boy who'd stood with her, and at Nora in the front row, with her weathered, unsentimental face and the dried wildflowers in Maggie's hand. And she said yes, with the full weight of everything the word contained. The fear she'd moved through to get there, the cost of trusting again, the particular courage it took to choose something real over something safe. The ring Elias put on her finger was plain gold, simple and solid, and it fit exactly right. 2 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived from the county land office. Harlan Voss had sold his interest in the Patterson property to a ranching consortium from Amarillo and had announced his intention to relocate to Fort Worth to pursue other investments. The letter was administrative and impersonal and communicated only facts. But Nora, who brought it out personally rather than trusting it to the mail, observed that men like Voss didn't relocate from territory they were winning, and that the documents Maggie had quietly assembled over the preceding weeks and sent to a judge she'd corresponded with during her teaching years had apparently been of some interest to certain parties in Amarillo who'd been watching Voss's activities for considerably longer than Maggie had. "You didn't tell me about the judge," Elias said when Nora had gone. "I told you I was going to put the questions in writing," Maggie said. "I didn't specify who I was going to give them to." He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped cataloging, because it was simply his face now when he looked at her. The undeflected attention, the lack of performance, the thing underneath it that had stopped being unnamed somewhere around the 3rd week of their marriage, when he'd come in from a hard day and sat down next to her on the porch without saying anything, and she'd understood that this was what it looked like when a man was home. "You're going to be impossible to manage for the rest of my life," he said. "I told you that the first day," she said. "You agreed to the terms." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side. And out in the corral, Jessie was working the new colt through a series of transitions with a competence and patience that would have been unrecognizable 3 months ago. And General was watching from his corner of the fence with the self-possessed dignity of an animal who had decided long ago that enthusiasm was beneath him, but who had, in recent weeks, been observed to move toward the fence when Maggie crossed the yard, which Cade said meant something, and Pete said was a miracle, and Jessie said was just General being weird. Spring came the way it always came to the Panhandle, not gradually, but in a rush. The land going from iron brown to tentative green in the space of 2 warm weeks. Maggie's roses on the south fence of her own farm bloomed in April, which she knew because she rode out to see them on a Sunday morning with Elias beside her, and they stood at the fence together and looked at the 4 small plants putting out their first flowers of the season against the old wood. And she thought about the woman who'd planted them the spring after Robert's funeral, because she'd needed something to do with her hands that wasn't crying. That woman had been trying to hold something together. This woman was building something. The farm was still hers. She rode out to it twice a month to check the property and keep it in order, because it was hers and she intended to keep it. Not from distrust, but because Elias had been right. She'd chosen this, knowing what it was, with both eyes open, and that meant the choice was clean, in a way her first marriage had never been. She didn't need the deed in her pocket anymore. It lived in the lock. "I heard you on the other side of it. You were deciding." "You could hear me deciding?" "I could hear you breathing." He looked out at the yard, at the corral where the horses moved in the last light, at the barn where Cade was doing the final check of the evening. "I stood there for a long time before I knocked. I almost didn't do it either." She looked at him. "Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was choosing words rather than avoiding them. "Because Nora told me you'd been alone long enough," he said.
And I thought, so have I. Inside, Jesse was reading, not for lessons, for himself. A battered book about navigation and surveying that he'd found in the and casualness that meant he was genuinely excited about it. Because he'd learned to trust that genuine excitement didn't have to be armored.
His voice drifted through the window sometimes, reading passages aloud, the way he did when something caught him. Not for an audience, just because the words were better said than held. Maggie listened to her stepson read in the warm evening, and felt her husband's hand in hers, and looked at the land they were building something on together, and thought about all the doors she'd opened, and all the ones she'd been afraid to, and understood, fully and without remainder, that the life she was living now had been waiting on the other side of her own courage the entire time. She had stopped measuring the distance to the door. She was not going anywhere. She was exactly, completely, and at last, irreversibly, home.